cream-colored envelope, typed in black ink, addressed to me, Mr. Malcolm Little, neat and perfect, like I'm worthy of something good.
Sorry about that, Ilyasah. We forgot to turn the recording on because we wanted to make sure that others could see this later on, and we missed part of that. Well, thank you so much for that reading. So, we talked about the fact that you had written 5 books already, and they've been about your mother and your father. But what made you decide to write this book and tell the story this way, and particularly now?
Well, I think, we look at what happened just this past summer. Here we all are, all of the human beings on this earth, confronted with a pandemic and not knowing what that meant, not knowing what COVID-19 was, which really forced us to question our mortality, and also forced us to watch a horrific killing of George Floyd. But I think the beauty of it, if we're going to look at the glass half full, is that young people were politicized, and they were awakened to not only their own humanity, but to all of our collective humanities. And in 50 states and in this country, in 18 countries abroad, there were people of every walk of life proclaiming that Black Lives Matter, and it was as if they finally got it. And when we think about mass incarceration, which preceded the pandemic, we learned that there are approximately 3 million people behind bars. And Brian Stevenson, who's someone that I really admire and teach in my classes, at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, he says that we're more than the worst mistake we've ever made, and that we would be judged not by how we treat the rich and the celebrated, the celebrities, but by how we treat the poor and incarcerated, meaning we have to have compassion, we have to care, we have to provide rehabilitative programs and of sorts. And we also have to provide after-school programs, just all of these things to make sure that we are being responsible for raising our children. But since 1970, with Nixon's war on drugs, the incarcerated population increased by 700%. And in 2012, we found that the United States spent 80 billion taxpayer dollars on correction facilities, not education, not assistance with skyrocketing tuition, but on correction facilities. And so writing this book gave me an opportunity to focus on the humanity of inmates, while also providing a more accurate information about my father's youth relative to the challenges that many young people continue to face today.
Well, I mean, it's a very powerful way of telling a story, setting it in the prison the way that you did, in setting up that journey, and in that perspective. And there's a lot of dialogue in the book. What were those conversations based on? Were those stories that were told to you, or were they recreated from research? I mean, did you hear these from aunts and uncles, or did you hear them from your father? I mean, you were quite young when he died. So, or did your mother tell you stories? How did this dialogue come to be? I'm just really curious about that.
I also want to thank you for having me, right? It's such an honor to be in New York City, right? At your school and with the parents and the students and community. These were stories that I grew up hearing from my aunts and uncles, my father's siblings. And one of the fortunate things that happened during COVID is I had an opportunity to work with a young man who was a film producer. We were, working on this deal, as well as, I should say young man, gentlemen, right? Another one who was in Japan working on biography. So there are so many stories, news stories that I also received during the same time frame of my father's life. And so it was really so exciting. And it also, was like an epiphany that we were going, to outlive this pandemic, because it was, how often would it be that three people were on the phone at the same time, and we decided to have weekly sessions that we are working on the same time period of my father's life. One with Raphael Monserrat, film producer in California, and then the other, Patrick Parr, big biographer who was in Japan. So we knew we were going to live so that we could complete these projects. So it came from many stories growing up from my aunts and uncles, and research, as well as these two gentlemen whom I had the pleasure and honor of working with over the winter.
And when did you start writing this book?
Ooh, I think we started maybe a year and a half before the book was released, maybe 2 years. I don't really remember, but no, I think it was a year. But because of COVID, we had time extended. And so it was these conversations that I had with Patrick Parr, especially because he had, microfilm, he had all this like amazing footage from the prison, from Harvard. His assistant, I believe, had a lot of microfilm that was at Harvard. It was just really amazing. So we had time extended, and it served us really well, because this extra information that no one ever had somehow landed right in our laps. Shorty was also in this experimental rehabilitative prison, and it was the Colony. And, it was like a college campus, and they had an extensive library. And that is how my father's sister convinced him to transfer to this particular location, because Malcolm was an avid reader. A lot of people think when Malcolm went to jail that he went in as an unlearned person, when in fact it was his parents who instilled these values, that while in the 7th grade he was the class president, while in 7th grade he was on top of his class, he played football, but that his favorite teacher asked him what he wanted to be. He was the only Black person in this particular area, Mason, Michigan, in his class. And they wanted to know, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said, I want to be a lawyer, because that's how he saw his dad. Speaking for people, protecting people, defending people. He got Marcus Garvey out of jail for the alleged mail fraud by writing a letter to then President Coolidge. And his teacher said, well, you have to be realistic. That is not a realistic goal he used the N-word. And, I liken it to young people systemically hearing that Black life doesn't matter, right? And the pain and angst that one, experiences. And if you don't have adults, if we smart, forward thinking, radical adults aren't around to help usher and guide all of our young people, whether we biologically birth them or not, then, these pains of finding themselves at a crossroads, they often silence themselves with perhaps loud music, with self-destructive behaviors, cigarettes, all kinds of things, as Malcolm, until being arrested at a young age and then having to confront all of the things that he was running from, which was his identity, with the backdrop of Jim Crow in the 1920s and 30s, and the reckoning of his dad being lynched and his mother being taken and put into an institution, and them taking their land, because Malcolm's father, this is the end of my response, Malcolm's father purchased land in the 1920s, and the land was reserved. It was it was premium land that was reserved then for whites only, and he purchased the land, and so he was lynched as a very young man.
The history of and the legacy of your family is so much more than just your father. I mean, what your grandfather did, and his ties to Marcus Garvey and the Garveyites is so deep as well, and your grandmother for that matter. It just, there's so much there, and it's so incredible. And you really, I think this is one of the first times we're really hearing so much about it.
And what it does, it underscores, Elinor, that it was because of Malcolm's parents, the tutelage, the foundation that they provided him and his siblings, the love of nature, the love of insects, the love of humanity, right? Care, compassion, and also the love for literature. She was the recording secretary for this organization that commanded millions of followers in the 1920s. And she instilled particular values in her son. And so thank goodness for that. And so I can't say how important it is, to subscribe to that proverb that it takes a village to raise a child, right? That we can't only be concerned about ourselves, right? But that we have to be concerned about all of our children, right? And certainly we want all of our children to know that they are worthy of self-love, that they are worthy of a quality education, and that they're worthy to participate in mainstream society if they so desire, right?
Absolutely. So, you just, gave us one of the proverbs that many people know, but, and who knows who that one was actually ever originally said by, but you chose some quotes in this book by your father, and there are some very profound ones there. How did you choose the ones that you did?
Well, so after finishing this book, right, we discovered that Malcolm was quoted 53.7 thousand times per hour per day in social media, which is the clearest indication.
How many?
53.7 thousand times per hour per day in social media. And this was the clearest indication that young people, were still attracted to Malcolm because Malcolm spoke truth, and truth is timeless. They realized that it was Malcolm speaking truth to power, that he didn't walk around angry. He was a compassionate man, and he was so young. He was only 39 when he was gunned down, and it was in his 20s, that he first came involved in the civil rights movement when he said, "We demand our human rights as your brother. We demand our human rights ordained by God." He introduced a human rights agenda to the civil rights movement. And so, young people were looking for strategies and tactics that they could employ to address these injustices that they had just witnessed, right? This horrific killing of George Floyd, seeing his humanity, and they turned to Malcolm X, and they discovered that Malcolm was, pretty humane, that he was an exemplar of morality. He simply provided the biggest critique of America with his insistence that America live up to her promise of liberty and justice for all of her citizens.
So when you did that research, did you find out what the most used quotes were of his? Can you share those with us?
Well, yes, there was one about, well, practically every one that we used in the book. There's so many great quotes. And especially, understanding that a lot of the quotes were reactions to injustice, right? He didn't just, as I said, he wasn't just an angry person for no reason. He had a profound reaction, very compassionate person to be so young, to injustice. And he sought, to, as I said, by providing the biggest critique of America, he sought solutions, right? And many of these quotes just seemed appropriate for the topic, for each chapter's topic, and to explain why he used those quotes. Or, they weren't quotes at the time, of course, but why he had created those statements and sound bites.
Well, I mean, and he may not even known he was creating those sound bites at the time. Those are just parts of his speeches that became, well, in some senses, iconic. Things that were picked up on that have been retweeted and retweeted and retweeted, and have become part of our lives and are retweeted 5,000, how many times an hour?
53.7 thousand times.
53 point, wow, that's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we have some math teachers in the audience that can do the math of how many times a day that would be and how many times it's been since Twitter was started. So your use of certain characters to tell certain parts of Malcolm X's story is quite intriguing. What do Chucky, Norm, and Bembry represent? And Chucky is a veteran who fought for his country, was beaten and sent to the hole for 15 months over some loose cigarettes. Did you include that for the correlation to how Eric Gardner was murdered by the police? Is it a commentary on how people of color in this country are treated once they take off their uniforms? And is there a correlation to the state of the Black man in present day America?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been since the time of the transatlantic slave trade, unfortunately, that, you saw just the disregard of one's humanity. When we look at all of the various cases, we look at, gosh, of course, now I can't even think of them, but these are the kinds of things that I teach in my course, Perspectives on Justice in the Africana World. When we look at Brown versus the Board of Education, when we look at Homer versus Plessy, when we look at all of these cases that went to the Supreme Court, that they were fighting for, recognition of their humanity. They were fighting for against violations of their human rights. And yes, of course, I would most certainly say so.
And
I would say that, that these kinds of injustices, these kinds of violations against one's human rights have just been, consistent. That Eric Gardner is not the first person that this happened to, right? But that this is something that has continually happened. And I think that this is what our young generation discovered when they witnessed, again, that killing of George Floyd, that, the many times that we talked about the Black Wall Street, that we talked about Juneteenth, that we talk about Harriet Tubman, that we talk about Frederick Douglass, that we talk about Dr. Martin Luther King, all of these individuals, during the course of our modern day American history, were, basically fighting for the same thing. And that was recognition of their humanity. As my father said, liberty and justice for all of its citizens.
So I'm just going to tell the audience that if you guys have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A section and we'll get to any that we can. So what lessons do you see in the awakening for young readers, especially, I'd say, elementary school and middle school
Well,
students?
yeah, I think it's really understanding and recognizing our humanity, right? I think in all of my books, what is consistent are the values that my parents instilled in me and my five sisters, right? My mother was just in her 20s when her home was firebombed. And, it was on Valentine's Eve, as she and her husband lay asleep in bed, that a bomb was thrown into the nursery where my sisters and I slept as babies, right? And 1 week later, she would witness, this horrific killing of her husband. And in spite of that, and she was pregnant with twins, and she was a young woman. And in spite of that, she raised us in a bubble of love, peace, joy. And so by the time I went to college, I was not what people expected, right? Because they expected a fiery orator and all of these things, and someone in combat. And what they found was, just say no to drugs, love, peace, joy. I went to summer camp in Vermont. I went to girls prep school. I went to college upstate New York. And my mother wanted her children to focus on their humanity, right? And self-love. And so what's consistent in all of my books is that it's an opportunity for young people to understand the importance, first and foremost, to love ourselves. If we don't know how to love ourselves, certainly we're not going to love others. Certainly we're not going to care about others, especially when we recognize injustice, right? And so if we're taught to hate, if we're taught racism, if we're taught discrimination, we're teaching our children how to hate themselves, right? By teaching them how to hate others. And so I think the lesson in all of these books is the importance of our humanity, that, we love ourselves first and foremost, right? And then, in doing that, we learn how to be great citizens and to be compassionate and, to, have this, brother and sister under the fatherhood of God sort of perspective, if you will.
So one of the questions that we've just been asked is, I want to know a little bit about how Norm was depicted, and they're recalling about in the book how one of the prisoners says about Norm, how that Malcolm should understand that Norm has only really seen lynchings and other crimes, and maybe that's why he's so frightened about seeing Black people stand up for himself.
Yes, I even tell people, when my father would say, "Look at you, your skin is like gold compared to this." We were psychologically traumatized generation after generation, right? Look at what happened in slavery. And I had written something where, if we're teaching our children the truth of history, we're teaching them how to be compassionate. We're teaching them how to be honest, how to be truthful, right? And so I would think that, now more than ever is the best time to ensure that we are really sharing the truths of our history. Certainly, Norm, as many others, have been psychologically traumatized. Whenever you have to fear lynchings, fear police brutality, with no accountability, right? Let's look at at Black Wall Street, right? Let's look at how, this whole community was bombed, right? Just because they were thriving. And it was just 40 years after slavery ended that there was this thriving community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? And there was a racial massacre of that community where their entire community was bombed and burned. And those survivors, the terror, the trauma that they endured, the same thing that happened in Rosewood, Florida. And so when Black people, they talk about the mass exodus of Blacks from the South. It wasn't that they were fleeing, for job opportunities to come to the North. They were fleeing lynchings because they were rampant. They were so rampant that Billie Holiday sang the song that strange fruit blowing in the wind, because wherever you looked, there were Black bodies and even white bodies, those who were accomplices or supporters or abolitionists, who would also be killed. And so this is, a time of such trauma. And so there were many people, behind bars and not behind bars who, and even today, who are still brainwashed and suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder.
So we've got some other questions. One of them is from Nicholas Griffith, and he wanted to know, his question is, growing up without a father, has writing these books helped you to get to know him a little bit better?
Yes, I love my father so much. I'm so grateful, for the seeds that he planted. And yes, writing the books really, for me, was to make sure that I provided a more accurate information about who he was, about his parents, instead of this false narrative that was out there. And I think it's really important to learn how to control our own narrative, right? Instead of, sitting back and complaining what our leaders aren't doing, complaining about what our schools aren't teaching our children, that we just learn how to participate in rewriting these, policies, right? For example, when we think about slavery, we're told that they were lazy, that they were shiftless, that they were unruly, and they're just called slaves. But now, educators say that we are calling them enslaved, right? So that way they are given an identity, that we recognize, that they were human beings like we are, that, if we have learned that Africa is the birthplace of civilization, and the most thriving civilization ever to exist in all humankind, then we have to look at those empires and kingdoms that were there, that these were refined and industrious men, women, and children who were kidnapped and endured this voyage, to be shipped around the world to cultivate lands and communities and cultures and so forth. And so if we control the narrative, then we can say that they were refined and industrious African people, they were refined and industrious indigenous Black, brown people who were here before Christopher Columbus, and that they were enslaved and held against their will in bondage and terror. And in spite that bondage and terror, look at what they gave to society, right? And had it not been for these enslaved individuals, that many of us would not have the opportunity today to call the United States of America the land of the free, the land of milk and honey, our home. And so we owe not just George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson, but there are so many more founding forefathers and foremothers to be grateful and to to acknowledge and make sure that they are properly recorded in history.
So Samil Sibs is asking, we've already said that you've written 5 books, but she wants to know what book is for the younger readers. And I know you talked about that at the neighborhood school when you were there a few years ago, but please tell them which ones they can get for young ones.
I need to have it very close. It's right on my library shelf. Malcolm Little, the boy who grew up to become Malcolm X. It's a great story because, again, it's Malcolm's mom teaching him about, the importance of insects, the importance of the garden, the importance of humanity, the importance of identity and love and leadership and all of those things. So I would say for the young child, a great book. And you also learn about history in each of the books. And so a great book for children is Malcolm Little, the boy who grew up to become Malcolm X, that I wish my arms were long enough to reach into.
And also, just so everyone knows, we just put in the chat the link to buy The Awakening. And we're also putting in the link to buy the other books as well, Betty Before X as well. And if you go to the link that we put in, that's also through our book fair for that's McNally Jackson books. And then we'll donate some money back to TNS for every book that you buy. And they are all really wonderful, wonderful books that talk about, the life of Malcolm X, the life of Betty Shabazz, before Malcolm, and they're all geared towards younger readers, and they're really remarkable ways to learn history from somebody that was really part of it. Now let's see, we've got some other questions here. Ilyasah, what do you think about our future past this pandemic in a year after George Floyd? What's next for us?
What is next for us? Well, I think that one of the greatest things is that our young people were politicized this summer. And it's great to see them concerned about humanity, right? My father said that it would be this generation of young people who would recognize that those in power have misused it and that they would demand change. And we're discovering, so much history about our country, right? Which is, connects, I think, all of us, that we should also critique, dismantle, and reform unjust, separate sets of rules under which America operates to bring about more egalitarian policy and be equally accountable to treating all of our young people as a start, regardless of their pronouns, regardless of their ethnicity, nationality, whatever it is, that we have to be responsible and accountable to ensure that they are receiving a education that is based on historical facts. And so there was an article that I wrote for Elle magazine, and it's a really short excerpt. The omission of Black, Indigenous, Brown, Asian, and Latin history is not accidental. These exclusions distance people from their own heritage and ultimately their own sense of self. A whitewashed curriculum enforces the myth that there have never been scholars, thinkers, innovators, caregivers, iconoclasts, artists, and revolutionaries across these various identities. Consider, for example, that Africa is the cradle of civilization. Hence, ancient African kingdoms were full of immense progress, scholarship, and knowledge. if we learned about them in the same way we learned about ancient Greece and Rome in our world history classes, we would appreciate the complexity of Black civilization and negate the teachings of bias and inherited racism and discrimination. We need to, and so forth, right? And so this is an opportunity to make sure that we are instilling a great value system for our young people, a value system of truth, a value system of honesty, of compassion, right? And that's what we are, able to do when we teach the truth of what happened. It's okay, right?
So you've actually almost answered the question that I was just asked in this in the question and answer section here, and this was asked by one of the parents, Tamika Hall. She says, "How do we, as Black and Brown people, continue not to be discouraged, despite the fact that a lot of crimes that were happening years ago are still happening to us now, just in a different format? What are some words of wisdom, encouragement that you can provide for young people watching these things happen?"
Oh, it's awful, right? We don't want our children to be terrorized and traumatized over and over and over again. And I think, the reason that I teach, and it's so funny that I can't think of these cases at the moment, although my I can. The reason that I teach the course that I'm teaching, and then I ensure that my students learn about these various cases, is to recognize the difference, to understand, or first to encourage critical thinking, right? But also to not see things from a Black and white lens, but rather have the capacity to recognize right from wrong, right? Because if we're not looking at it from a Black and white perspective, then we're more compassionate, right? Because we've been programmed to see things from this Black and white perspective. Dred Scott versus Sanford, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus the Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act of 1965 and the Voters' Rights Act, of 1964, the Voters' Rights Act of 1965, Nixon's war on drugs. Every time advances were made, it's just unfortunate that, there was a way to just kind of pull us back. So the goal becomes making sure that we are strategic and organized, so that when we march, we're not just marching and protesting and demonstrating, and then at the end of the marches, we come home and what have we accomplished? So it's making sure that, we're organized, we're strategic. That's what my father talked about. And that we have a check mark for the things that we want to accomplish. So then once the marching and protesting is over, we know that there are goals that we must accomplish.
So actually, here's another question. I love this question. How do you think your mom would have reacted, filtered, directed you and your sisters on social media, mores, usage, and bullying?
I think you got a little, I didn't hear the ending.
I said, how do you think your mom would have reacted, filtered, directed you and your sisters on social media, mores, usage, and bullying?
Oh gosh. I think my mother would, if there's bullying, you see, my mother made sure that we had a solid foundation so that we didn't rely on others to determine our self-worth, right? We knew that we were great. We learned about the contributions women made, the African diaspora made, and Islam made. So we were very solid in our, with ourselves, and we wouldn't focus on, so what, somebody's bullying you, it's not the end of the world. What's most important is the day of judgment, right? What does God think of you? Can you look at yourself in the mirror and like the reflection that you see? So it's instilling particular values and understanding who you are. And that way, when you have friends, they have, there's like a checklist that they have to have in order, to be in your space, to be friends, that we have standards for ourselves and we have standards for our mates, our friends. And so, I remember going to college and, maybe a boy told me that, you know, I'm not supposed to wear lipstick because lipstick is swine. And so I was like, really? You know, I was so naive. So I would call my mother, and my mother said, sweetheart, if you want to wear lipstick, wear your lipstick. So I was like, okay. She just made sure that we were self-sufficient, you know, that we didn't rely on others to determine our worth. And so if there's physical bullies, if they're social media bullies, it really doesn't matter at the end of the day, because God is the only judge, right? And at the end of the day, that's really all that matters.
So we have another question about books and other resources, and what other, in addition to your books, what other books or resources would you recommend for young people?
Jason Reynolds has some really great books. The young lady that I wrote, Betty Before X, Renee Watson, she has some really good books. And actually, you know, self-love was, you know, as I said again, it was so important to my mother, you know, because you really want we all want our children to be self-reliant, right? And, you know, I'm just so grateful that my mother, you know, made sure, you know, that we were that way. And so Renee Watson just did a book, and I think it's called Self-Love or Love Self or something like that I post on social media. So I think any book like Betty Before X is another great book, because it's Betty, you know, learning to have conversations with God. You know, if there was something she didn't understand, if there was something about herself, her relationship and her conversations that she would have late at night with God, you know, helped. And, you know, and so of course, by the end of the book, you know, we see a brand new Betty. But Jason Reynolds is a great author. There's so many great authors out now. And I just actually did a panel with some really great authors. And I said that I was going to get their books. And of course, I don't know where that is, but there's so many great books right now.
All right. And also, yeah, can you tell us a little bit about your co-writer, Tiffany?
Yes,
Tiffany.
Yes. Tiffany D. Jackson. Tiffany is a Howard graduate. I chose her for this book because, you know, I always want to make sure that you can visualize the story, that you feel like you are Malcolm, right? That as he stumbles, that you're stumbling with him, and as he's learning and discovering, you know, things that will be helpful to him, so are you. And what I really loved about Tiffany is that she came from a film background. And so she is, you know, a visionary, and I mean, a visualist. And that was very important to me. And also she's fearless. And that was also important to me. And so, you know, Tiffany has some really great young adult novels as well.
And so can you share with us your social media handles? So if people want to follow you on Instagram and on Twitter and things like that, they can.
So my website is ilyasahshabazz.com, and my Instagram and Twitter are at Ilyasah Shabazz, and Facebook.
And then what is the actual class that you teach at John Jay? Because you've talked about it, but what is the course called?
Yes, it's called Perspectives on Justice in the Africana World. And where we start off is asking, why are Black people all around the world looking for justice? What's happening to them? Who is denying them their human rights? And then just, you know, looking at the Blacks in China, looking at the Blacks in Australia, looking at the Blacks in the Philippines, looking at the Blacks in Europe. And I tell you, it is just an eye awakening.
Well, I've got to say, this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us and all of our families today. I hope a whole bunch of books were bought. I know I'm going to buy a whole bunch. Um, and, you know, every time I get to talk to you, I just absolutely love it. We've got to do it a lot more. And the links are all in there. Again, we apologize for any technical difficulties some of you may have had getting in. We have recorded this, so we will make it available so you guys can see it if you missed any of it. And again, Ilyasah, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. If you haven't gotten to read the book yet, please do. It's really fabulous for both adults and children alike. And I want to thank the neighborhood school and the co-presidents of the PTA for letting this happen and having this happen, and for the principal, our fabulous, fearless leader, Diane V. Spielberg, and our librarian, Cheryl Wolf. Yes, thank you all for coming today. And oh, wait, we may have another question here. Oh, so people are telling us they've just ordered it, and thank you so much for ordering it. And everyone have a wonderful, wonderful evening, and keep on reading, everyone. Take care. Bye, everybody.